Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the first 10 episodes of Sabin's Beetleborgs. Ultimately, hearing full well this show at some point was called Big Bad Beetleborgs, and then ultimately the name was changed to just Beetleborgs. I had seen this show from its first iteration, and when it was on TV, and I really enjoyed the show. I liked the fact that it was kind of taken from a comic book and put into a real thing. That's what I think I kind of enjoyed about this show, anyways. This show was probably the weirdest thing that I've probably ever seen in my life when rewatching it, because I'm like, okay, this show is just, it kind of feels like a cluster of just kind of random stuff all tossed together. And if anything, it was kind of interesting to see in one episode of these 10 episodes, you actually see a Power Rangers villain's head in one of the shots. You ultimately see the head of the Sphinx from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers in one of the shots, which I actually thought was really cool. I thought it was interesting that it seemed that all these kids were actually working in seemingly a comic book shop, if you can even call it that, because it seemed like it was a comic book shop, but it was also like collectibles and all kinds of stuff. It was kind of whatever they needed to probably sell during that time period or whatever, to be like a merchandising machine like thing. So we had some very weird approaches of villains in this story. If really we didn't have it to be that the Beetleborgs almost had at some points, they had the haunted house that ultimately had a lot of the mummy or Frankenstein or vampire-ish like characters that are placed within it, to where ultimately that leads them to be scared at some point of just them. Then ultimately we have, of course, pulling of the fact that when eventually these kids eventually become their dream, which is ultimately to become these Beetleborg like characters, we have it to where also they are going to, of course, need villains to combat. So we have very weird or strange names for villains in the show. We have like Vexer, who is the actual seemingly like Lord Zed-ish like villain, and he seems to be like the high tier villain, which he's kind of telling everybody else to do. We have Typhus, who is ultimately the like shark-ish looking character with the kind of like the shark head, which I thought that visual was really interesting. But I think probably a lot of these monsters, as well as probably any of the monsters that end up being incorporated into the show, are honestly just kind of tossed together. I think for this show, like, Sabin was already cranking out just a bunch of monsters, so they just kind of tossed in a number of monsters in this one. Because with Power Rangers, they were like tossing a ton of just random monsters that kind of didn't make any sense in there. So I guess for this show, they were even just tossing out even more, like, hey, we can just do this. Like, whoever the monster creator was with Sabin, like, I bet they made a freaking killing just because of how many numerous shows they had to be tied with, like VR Troopers and Beetleborgs and everything along those lines. Which ultimately, I think if you look at VR Troopers and you look at Beetleborgs, like, it feels kind of almost like one and the same to me for the most point, where it kind of like, I think VR Troopers could be, if anything, much more of a prototype for Beetleborgs. Because looking at it, you have these, you have these ships that keep flying in that ultimately we have forcibly them needing to fight seemingly every episodes with their uh, with their Zords of sorts. The Magnivore jet fighter or jet fighters. Okay, sure. That came in seemingly every single episode, and like I didn't quite understand that. I didn't quite understand the. I didn't understand the actual approach of how. Like I think there was like kind of product placement there, but I guess they couldn't figure out how. Like I guess they were trying not to avoid to have some like Beetleborg Megazord thing going on, and so recently they just kind of they ended up trying to sell some kind of toy product where they had to keep like selling people Zords, but they ultimately didn't want to have like a monster grow to an absurd size for most of this thing, so they just kind of put in these jet fighters. So we also have Noxic, which ultimately I'm like, okay, here's like I would have said this would have been a character that would have probably been used as an inventor character, but it seems that that never like showed any fruit to use that character. So I guess ultimately they just like, well, how about we just have this character just be in here as just any third party person and just be one of these goons. And then we had Jara, that is kind of uh, like a Russian, like a Russian, uh, a Russian kind of female-ish like monster, which I kind of liked, but ultimately when looking at it full well, like for this person, like you could always tell that they weren't speaking or weren't talking, or whatever. All the other ones you can kind of like play around with that they could, and this and that. But anyways, like for this person, like it looks like they're just straight up just wearing like a Jason hockey mask of sorts, or like a Casey Jones ash like mask of sorts. It was kind of, but it was still kind of interesting. I liked the visual. So moving on. So going on into here, we have of course Drew, Joe, and we have I believe Roland. Let's go into the actual cast. Rollin. And so they end up having to, of course, be as per usual as that same old song and dance where you have one haunted house that is in this neighborhood. And so recently you have two other kids that are ultimately, I guess, rich kids of this world that are ultimately going to bet Drew, Joe, and Roland to spend the night there. And so reasonably they end up spending some time at this haunted house to find themselves kind of mixed up with a bunch of monsters. But then they end up finding out a seemingly genie-ish like character called Flabber, which I'm like, okay, so was this kind of a ripoff of Flubber that ultimately I think was done around that time period, and then plus it was just kind of like this character was kind of a genie, Robin Williams, but Elvis like ripoff, and like I guess you couldn't have called him Jin or something like that, or you couldn't have called him like Genie or whatever like that. You couldn't have called him that. Some kind of variation of Genie. So it seems like because these kids were the only people that have found this Flabberish like character, ultimately they seem to have been granted a wish, and of course they wish to be Beetleborgs, and because ultimately that is their all three of their favorite comic books. Funny enough, I kind of found out that it seemed like there was a ton of people that ended up being recasted through the show. A lot of people ended up having to get recasted, probably as the Wolfgang character. They had to recast him, or even Joe, I think, had gotten recasted through some portion of the show. kind of showcasing that already one of the kids through one of the episodes of this 10 episodes like had to be like an invisible girl. I'm like, okay, so did she have to be gone through most of this episode? And like they had to voice over her afterwards. But anyways, it was kind of interesting to see this approach, because ultimately it kind of feels like the Power Rangers turbo like way of like, okay, well, we have these kids, but eventually they're going to morph, I guess, into these much more adult superheroes. Um, and I was kind of impressed with, like, man, these suits look like really, really thick. I remember full well having like the action figures of Beetleborgs, and funny enough, like I would always use like Beetleborgs would always like kind of end up teaming up with Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and it's kind of funny that the Beetleborgs, if you watch the Forever Red episode, the Beetleborgs are actually in um, the Forever Red episode as villains, because I guess they just like, hey, we got this crap lying around. How about we use it for this show? Maybe nobody remembers Beetleborgs all that much, so let's just kind of incorporate them onto the show as villains. So, and I always have to talk about that because I always found it to be funny. So, going on to this episode, we ultimately have the kids that eventually all have to eventually all get superpowers. We have Roland, who evidently has super speed. We have Drew, who seems to have the power of Charles Xavier, where he can move stuff with his mind. And then we have Joe, who ultimately has super strength, which I'm like, okay, that's cool, having Joe have super strength. So recently, it seems that like I'm not quite really sure about the relationship between all three of these kids. Uh, like I would assess and or assume that reasonably are they family? Are they all Are they kind of like did we ultimately have to where seemingly uh, Aaron, who is Aaron Williams in this show, who ultimately owns his comic, did he just adopt all these kids? Uh, we also seemingly have uh, a grandmother, which I thought was kind of hilarious. And I think at some points she is kind of over the top a little bit, but when looking at it, like a lot of these characters are over the top. A lot of these characters goofy. So when we go into the haunted house, the haunted Hearst house or whatever it ends up being called, we have like a Frankenstein character. We have Mummy. We have a Mummy character who's called Mums. We have eventually uh, a werewolf character that shows up into one of these episodes that eventually is going to be incorporated into this house called Wolfgang. We have Count Fangula. We have a Frankenstein character that I believe is called Frankenbeans or Frankenbean. Um, and then, of course, we have to where we have these small little girl. We have these small, we have like women that are in this piano that are ultimately like, I'm just like, that is so weird because we have Flabber, but then we have Flabber that has like these women that are in this piano. It's so weird. So going on into here, I like eventually where this show eventually heads, because knowing full well they eventually get the creator of Beetleborgs in here, and he just starts shelling out and creating a bunch of monsters for the villains to fight. And I thought that was really cool, to actually have a person actually drawing monsters for the show. I thought that was actually cool to incorporate. Um, that those kinds of things. I thought that was really cool. Really though, I think every single like actual monster that they add into here was kind of a waste of time to me. Because really we don't really much marinate on the monster. Like the monster doesn't have a tying in story. It's just kind of there to just be like, well, I guess we have to have a monster in this story, but it's not good enough to. It's just kind of there. It's just kind of there for the Beetleborgs to fight something, to have to morph, and then realistically, the Beetleborgs have to just shove into fighting the jet fighters with their Zords, um, or with their whatever their vehicles are called. I don't know what they're called. I just keep calling them Zords because I'm a person that knows much more of Power Rangers than anything else. So to me, though, I think that this show, like, maybe they were probably looking at this show as it being eventually being like, hey, what are we gonna do with Common Rider, the Masked Rider? Because I know like they would have like Beatles for him for his character, and so maybe they were kind of coming up with some Common Rider like things, but then they end up settling with Beetleborgs, I guess. Um, because I know full well they were probably coming up with so many designs for Common Rider to eventually be a thing, but then eventually they're like, well, hey, how about we go with this instead? And so I guess that must have been what this show was, because I can't help but think that recently, like, they were all already coming up with so many things, and eventually just, like, maybe they were going with a VR Troopers reboot, but they end up sticking with Beetleborgs instead. So, anyways, going into more of this show, I think that's all I have to talk about in a non spoiler like sense. I think we can just kind of go into spoilers about the show. So let's dust out that double five. To otherwise just say, chicken. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that spoiler time to spoil the show. Whew. So within these first 10 episodes, we have it seemingly where again the kids all have to be bedded to go into this horror this Hillhurst house, whatever it's called. I think people always get the name confused and whatever. Um, so going into this, they end up having to be surprised by otherwise a mummy who is called Mums. He ends up unraveling his mummy uh, costume to reveal that he is some kind of mummy monster underneath, and he ends up chasing the kids around. We ultimately find out that the rich kids that were betting on Drew, Roland, and Joe to be in this house, they were going to plan to they were going to plan to scare them as well, but it ends up that they end up getting scared as well. So we have it seemingly to where these two rich kids are kind of like the bulk and skull of this story that are trying to be also like the villains of this story, to where they're at some point trying to either destroy this haunted house or try to get some detective or some kind of um, ghostbuster of sorts to try and annihilate uh, this haunted house, but that doesn't quite work out. So, anyways, and I thought that that was really cheesy because the guy who ends up being supposedly the ghost blaster of sorts, like he actually comes in with an actual like Ghostbuster esque like car, and I was like, oh, really, really. So we have it within here that we have these kids that all go in here and are ultimately to unleash this flabber, and ultimately this flabber is very much like Robin Williams' genie. Like he is basically being several different personas, as well as seemingly just like this guy is really just like, man, I really want to fill up my portfolio of characters that ultimately I could be for this show. Um, which there's nothing wrong with that when looking at it. So we have it to where Flabber is ultimately going to grant these kids' wishes of being Beetleborgs. But all while that is happening, we seemingly have this Flabber character that is making a lot of mistakes. We ultimately have it to where, in the very first episode, we have Blabber who is going to, instead of changing the Beetleborgs, the kids into Beetleborgs, he ends up changing them into rats at first. And then ultimately he ends up making a mistake, and then he grants their wish of being Beetleborgs. But then eventually we have it to where the the villains of this story end up coming out of the pages of this book as well. And so, reasonably, even when the kids in this very first episode kind of defeat the villains in this very first episode, the problem is that Flabber is telling them that they have to get the villains back into the comic books, or they're going to have to be Beetleborgs forever until they ultimately end up defeating all these villains. So I thought that was really interesting. So we eventually have the villains who end up pulling a lot of the villains or the monsters through the pages of other Beetleborg issues. And so like it's interesting enough that it seems like Drew and Roland and Joe are really big fans of Beetleborgs, where they ultimately know every single villain that comes up. And so I thought that was really cool. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly there are certain episodes where we have to kind of showcase this grandmother, to where it seems that she is so cool to where she can outrace any younger motorcyclist, and she knows karate and all this kinds of other goofy looking stuff, to wherever like it's like, man, it Flabber is kind of like a person that is going to try to like put everything to his portfolio. So is this grandmother. Like this grandmother is like, whatever they need her to be in this story, that's what she's going to be. And Flabber is kind of like the same thing. Whatever they need him to be is like, that's kind of the weird thing about this show, is like there's some characters that are kind of all over the place. So we have to where consistently within this episode, it always kind of ends the same way. Even when we incorporate a special monster into every single episode, like, sometimes has a story, but a bulk of the ways in which that these stories end up going is like, okay, well, like, story happens, and then, okay, well, we have to figure out a way to resolve that story, and then have them morph into Beetleborgs, fight whatever monster it is, and then ultimately have them attack these jet fighters with their Zord-esh like things, which I keep saying swords when they're not actually Zords. And that's how every single episode wraps up. Um, so going into this, we have like an episode where ultimately we seem to have Drew, who's seemingly going to have this girl Heather that also works in this comic book store as a relationship. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is probably going to be like Zach and the one girl that was ultimately mining more from Power Rangers, where basically it's going to be like, oh, maybe Drew's going to be able to get with this Heather girl, and ultimately she's going to be the damsel in distress that it's ultimately going to be incorporated in some of these episodes, to where Drew has to save her. Because ultimately Drew and Joe are brother and sister, and again, I'm assuming or assessing that Roland is I don't know. I just don't quite understand this family dynamic. Like I'm assuming Roland is the brother of Drew and Joe. Am I wrong? I don't know. I don't know. I don't quite understand this family. Um, but anyways, we have to because there's no other like you don't see Joe and Drew's mom and dad or anything like that. So I guess you just have to assess that they're like because they don't say anything about anyone's backstory. At some points, like they didn't even say that Roland had like super speed or whatever. Like it didn't really come down to really showcasing all that well that these kids had powers. It just seems like at some point they just showcase it at some point in some episode where it's like, oh, you have super speed now, and oh, you have super strength, and oh, you have this now, and I was like, okay, what? I'm like, okay, I'm a little confused. So ultimately it's some like a lot of the times it kind of incorporates these two rich kids into every story. um like one episode we have the rich kids who are trying to destroy the haunted house of sorts, and so we have the Beetleborg kids that are trying to prevent them from doing that, and ultimately we have the haunted house characters that are trying to scare away these construction workers, and that ends up working well. Uh, in one episode, we have it to where we have the ghost blaster character that comes in to try to get rid of all the ghosts that are supposedly in this haunted house, even though they're all not ghosts, they're just monsters. And so this ghost blaster guy comes in, and ultimately we find out that he is a liar of sorts. He's a con artist, and so recently he's just conning his way through this whole thing like you would normally see in like a lot of these kinds of episodes where it's like, oh, this person isn't actually who they say they are. And the monster of the week kind of comes in, and ultimately you have the ghost blaster that is a guy that's not going to be able to take down this monster. And so we have it to where, because ultimately Flabber is ultimately seeing this ghost blaster guy, and he's like, well, he better like the only probably way to take down a ghost is with like a plasma like weapon, and ultimately we find out that like this ghost blaster guy has this plasma like weapon, but he doesn't even know how to use it, or he's just scrambling words together to make it look like he has a legitimate weaponry, which doesn't actually work. And so reasonably we also find out that again, this guy is a con artist of sorts, and is really just like trying to get money out of these rich kids. And so recently he's telling them, "Oh yeah, I think I've like taken down all these ghosts." But then when the monsters come in and the monster of the week comes in, like we really see how this guy is not going to be able to take these people down, and he's just a con artist that ultimately won't be able to do the legitimate job needed. So at some point we even have like the grandmother who had to go to some karate tournament in one episode, and so recently we have her going on her train, and so recently we have like an entire we have monsters kind of just coming in and just fighting off whichever, and it ends up that uh, there is something wrong with this train that ultimately the grandmother is on, to ultimately where it's making the train even later to come off or come out or be a thing. At some point, when we have the villains kind of figuring out about this world, like in the very beginning of this, I thought it was kind of funny how every single one of the villains, uh, like the Jara and the Narox and the Typhus go to a movie theater, and they're trying to eat popcorn, but of course they don't have the actual like ability to really actually eat popcorn, and so really just kind of see them in a movie theater, and some people are like leaving the movie theater just because of their weirdness. And so eventually people are actually looking back on these monsters and they actually get scared because ultimately everybody's paying too close of attention to the movie instead of actually these monsters, to where when they actually look at the monsters they actually all get scared and they run off, which I thought was funny. So pushing on, we eventually get one episode where we have a character come in called Wolfgang, and he's a werewolf, of course, and so he ends up going into some hotel room to get a room, and when the hotel person looks at him, he's like, "Oh my god, it's a werewolf!" And then he runs off, and the werewolf's like, "Hey, I'm trying to get a room." So we have to where Wolfgang is trying to live a normal life with normal people, and we have it to where ultimately instead like he's creating havoc everywhere he goes because reasonably everybody's treating him like a monster, so they're all like, we have it to where the grandmother changes into her karate gear to try to fight off this Wolfgang character, and so it was like that was such a weird thing. So we have to where the villains and the heroes are trying to buy the affection of this Wolfgang-like character, because the Beetleborgs are going to have Wolfgang live with the rest of the other monsters, because ultimately we have the Beetleborgs asking Flabber, it's like, hey, do you guys know about a werewolf? And ultimately the vampire mentions like, oh, Wolfgang? Yeah, I know that guy. If anything, he'll probably be able to find us, because if anything, he'll probably be able to smell us out. Um, he'll be able to get to us, and ultimately we have the count. We ultimately have the count, who is ultimately just like, yeah, and I don't want to live with him. I don't want to live with that guy. So, but eventually it seems that Wolfgang ends up going with the villains at first to for them to have this Wolfgang showcase his ability to create havoc, and but ultimately the Wolfgang ends up sneaking away to go into Flabber's home and just kind of live there, and to where ultimately the villains are trying to grab Wolfgang and stuff like that to try and get him back to working with them, and so on and so forth. So reasonably we have it to where Wolfgang eventually gets to live with the other haunted Ashlight characters, and that's, I guess, the finishing touch of that story. And then eventually we have jet fighters come in, and then so ultimately the Beetleborgs have to go and fight them off. Uh, but yeah, so eventually we get on here to where reasonably there is. I'm trying to remember if there's any other episodes that ultimately have a real interesting story going on with these 10 episodes. Let me probably pause here and let me double check in my brain noggin to figure out if there's any other episodes that seem very interesting. Because every once in a while, this just comes down to there just being a monster just plopped into there, and then they have to fight that out. Oh, there's a time of which where Roland ends up trying to use magic or try to do magic tricks, and we end up having Flabber who gives Roland a book of real magical spells. We have it to where Roland ends up making Joe imaginable, and so we have or imaginable, invisible, and so we have the entire episode where we just have Roland and Drew who are to be Beetleborgs, because we have Joe who can't be a Beetleborg because she's invisible. So we have Joe who couldn't be a Beetleborg in this episode, but ultimately she's an invisible presence that ultimately has to say words and talk and whatever. And so we have it to where within this episode that Noxic, uh, who is the trench coat wearing guy, ends up taking the book of spells, and then he is ending up using these spells against the Beetleborgs. At some point, it seems that they're making pizza like turn into flame and disappearing at this pizza place, and it seems like they're kind of doing that uh, with the minion-ish like characters. I believe they're called. Uh, I believe they're called Skugs or Skogs or something. Uh, Scabs, I believe. Um, or Scrabs? I don't know. We have kind of. They're kind of like. They look very much like B-ish like characters to me. But so, anyways, we push on to eventually have of course, Roland using this magical power or out of this book to eventually have Joe become normal again. Because in the end, it's like, yeah, like we have to have this character be eventually back to normal, because ultimately every episode has to kind of be bottled within one another for most of the point. But anyways, so we eventually at some point have every single time somebody is incorporated in the Flabber house, eventually it seems that they forget their memory of the day. Like at some point, we have Heather who ends up forcibly going into the Flabber house, and because ultimately we have it to where the villains end up kidnapping her to kind of hold her over uh, the Beetleborgs, so that way Drew can rescue her, but then eventually uh, Heather's memory of the whole thing is gone. We ultimately have some point where there is a love spell necklace to ultimately uh, we have to where at the comic shop a love necklace is being dropped off, and so we have the grandmother who ends up putting on the necklace, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of guys that are otherwise claiming their love for the grandmother. And at some point, the grandmother is having all these people work in her comic book store to pledge allegiance to her. So the grandmother is kind of like, oh my god, I'm being smothered by all these men, and like I gotta figure out who's gonna be able to help me like figure out this whole thing, and to the point to where ultimately we have the grandmother going to Flabber's house to try to figure out how to cure all this whole thing, and while that is going on, we have all the monsters who end up falling for the grandmother as well. So it eventually has it to where Flabber ends up like trading places with the grandmother to ultimately like get to where she's going to evade these monsters to where Flabber is going to evade these monsters so that way the grandmother can sneak out of the house. So we eventually just easily resolve that by just kind of getting rid of this eventual necklace, and that kind of resolves that story. So yeah, some kind of interesting episodes coming out of here. I'm also gonna have to try to let me pause here to ultimately see if there's any stories that I could kind of come up with. Let's pause. Kind of not really. It seems that I think there was also an episode where we had a movie wanting to be filmed in front of the haunted house. To ultimately, we have to kind of tell the haunted monsters that are the we have to tell the monsters that reasonably their home is going to be taken over by a film crew that is going to film some movie, and we ultimately have some bug monster coming in and kind of the director's like, oh my god, this monster is going to have to be used for our movie. And so this monster ends up using up his power in here. But reasonably, it's just like they try to evade this monster to come off to the set to have the Beetleborgs like take him down. So eventually, they have to have it to where the Beetleborgs end up using their power of they end up having to forcibly destroy the film of this movie to where ultimately the guy is just like, well, like, F it. Like, everything went horribly wrong on the set. If anything, I just, like, the film was all destroyed. And so now I'm just going to go and make some story up that just seems just like the Beetleborg story. And that's what I'm going to do. And so recently, that's the kind of right off to the sunset episode that this goes into. I also believe that there was some rat monster that was incorporated into the 10th episode, and reasonably, there's kind of just mainly just kind of rat jokes within that episode. There's not much of a real, true, legitimate story out of that. I think other than that, there's probably maybe like one more episode that I'm probably like skipping around about. Um, but I think that's pretty much it. So, I know, anyways, yeah, there was some kind of interesting episodes here. I can't help but also think this show is really like it's really kind of cheesy, or it's really kind of like it has some real cheese into it, just because you have like kind of kids that are kind of being the main focal point of characters, and so it kind of has to have that kind of has to have that cheese element into it. um I kind of enjoyed the show, but it was kind of a show that I kind of had to like warm up to watching. But I don't know, I thought it was kind of fun. But other than that, I think I'm going to call this one a wrap for today. I'm going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Goodbye everybody.